hop in a boat just off the coast of Aberdeen, Scotland, and you cruise eastward, after about 7 hours, depending on your speed and the weather, you would come across this massive man-made structure jutting up out of the ocean. It looks like a cross between a construction site and a corporate office building sitting on top of 100-foot-tall metal stilts. It's called Magellan, and it is an offshore oil rig, and it will remain in place until all the oil has been sucked up in that area. The people who work, often for weeks or months at a time, on rigs like Magellan are known as roughnecks, and they have one of, if not the most dangerous job in the world. All exterior surfaces on these offshore rigs are always slick, either with water or oil, and so there is a constant risk of falling, sometimes hundreds of feet. If you're up on a higher platform, you could fall to a lower platform, which could be fatal, or you could fall clean off the rig all the way to the ocean 100 plus feet below. If you add in some bad windy weather, the risk of falling increases tenfold. Also, the crude oil that these roughnecks are drilling for is highly combustible, and so fires are a huge concern as well. And if that wasn't risky enough, there's also this phenomenon known as a blowout, where basically the oil well that the drill is actually drilling into will just explode. Now, all rigs have some sort of mitigating equipment to try to save themselves in case this occurs, but in reality, if it happens and you are unfortunately near the drill when it happens, you are likely to be killed or maimed. While the downsides of working on an oil rig are fairly obvious, the upsides are too, namely, your pay is fantastic. In 2000, a 41-year-old father of two named Gordon Moffat was a roughneck working on the Magellan. His primary job was to perform maintenance on the drill. Now, these offshore rigs work great most of the time, but they do have a habit of breaking down fairly often. And for a drilling company, anytime they are not sucking out crude oil, they're losing money. And so it was just a known thing when you worked on one of these rigs that as soon as there is an issue that causes the drill to stop working, it must be fixed immediately. Whether it's day, night, horrible weather, good weather, it didn't matter. It had to be fixed right away. And so on the night of October 9th that year, Gordon had just gotten back to his quarters to end the day when he got a call on his radio that he was actually needed to come back out to fix a problem that had stopped the drill. Now, Gordon was a seasoned roughneck, and he had grown quite accustomed to these late night calls to go out and fix things, and so he wasn't annoyed. He just put his stuff back on, turned around, and he headed out the door. When Gordon got to the main deck, which is this wide open metal platform right in the middle of the rig where the drill actually passes down through it on its way to the ocean, when he got to the main deck, he was met by some of his co-workers who told him where he would need to go. The cabling that needed fixing was located right below the main deck. However, it was not accessible from the main deck. In order for Gordon to get to it, he would need to go down to the next lowest platform from the main deck. Basically, he would need to hop in an elevator and go down one floor. And from this lower deck, the crew on the main deck would lower down a harness attached to a long wire. They would feed it down through this hole in the main deck platform called a mouse hole. It was about 10 inches across, and they would feed it down, and he would grab the harness, he would put it on, and then he would signal up to the main deck crew who could literally see him through this mouse hole. They would turn around and they would signal somebody called the hoist operator, and they were located above the main deck, slightly back. They couldn't actually see Gordon, so they're relying on communications with the people on the main deck. And the hoist operator would start their winch, and a winch basically reels in the wire that was connected to the harness that was on Gordon. And so once the hoist operator was informed, he'd turn on the winch, and then Gordon would be raised up until he could access these cables, and then he'd do his maintenance and be lowered back down, and that would be it. Now, Gordon and the crew had done maintenance using this winch system many times before, so this was a very routine fix. So Gordon made his way from the main deck down to the slightly lower deck, and he looked up at the mouse hole, and he watched as the main deck crew members lowered the harness with the wire attached to it down through the mouse hole. And so Gordon grabbed the harness, he put it around his waist, and he secured it. And after he was sure it was on correctly, he signaled up to the crew on the main deck that he was ready to start, and they in turn turned around. They flagged the hoist operator, who started the winch. And so very slowly, Gordon was lifted off the platform he was standing on, and he was brought up after several minutes, all the way up about 10 feet to access these cables. And as soon as he was parallel with them, he waved waved to the main deck crew, who were not far from him at this point, and he said, "I'm good." And so they turned around, they told the hoist operator, who stopped the winch. And so Gordon got his tools out and he began working on these cables, and the whole time he's trying to stay in one place because the wind is whipping through and he's kind of dangling and swinging around. And then eventually he finishes the repair, the cables are good, and so he signals the crew on the main deck through the mouse hole that he was good to go. "You can lower me back down now." And so the main deck crew, they turn, they wave to the hoist operator to go ahead and lower Gordon, and the hoist operator, he gives the thumbs up and he starts the winch. However, the hoist operator accidentally forgot to switch the direction of the winch. And so when he started it again, instead of the winch spooling the wire out and lowering Gordon, it continued to reel the wire in, pulling Gordon upward. Now, the winch did not move very quickly, and so it wasn't like Gordon is rocketing up towards the mouse hole. However, this problem was immediately recognized by Gordon and the main deck crew, and so they're frustrated. They're yelling up at the hoist operator saying, "Stop, stop, stop, reverse the winch." They're all waving and flagging this guy down, but the hoist operator, after he had hit start on the winch, had just kind of turned around, because this is a routine thing they've done a million times before, and so he's not looking at the crew on the main deck, so he has no idea what's going on. And it was so windy and loud that night on board the rig that he couldn't hear their cries, and so the winch just continued to reel in the wire, slowly raising Gordon closer and closer to the mouse hole. Now, Gordon could not get out of his harness unless he was on the platform below, so there was no way to escape the situation he was in. And so Gordon, after a few seconds of this not stopping and him continuing upward, he starts screaming. He's not annoyed anymore, he's terrified, and so is the crew on the main deck. They are now frantically screaming at the hoist operator to stop the winch, but nothing is working. And so one of the main deck crew members, sensing that they need to do something different to get this guy's attention, he runs away from where the mouse hole is to this nearby phone, and this phone is connected up to the hoist operator station, and he picks it up and it starts dialing. Up in the hoist operator station, he's still not paying attention when the phone rings. He grabs the phone, puts it to his ear, and immediately he's hit with screams to stop the winch. And so the hoist operator, totally confused, whips around and hits stop on the winch. But it was too late. Just a few moments earlier, Gordon had finally been pulled all the way up right to the entrance of the underside of this mouse hole. And as he reached this hole, he tried to position himself in a vertical position so that maybe he could slip his upper body into the hole and he could just kind of slide through the hole. He'd still be hurt by it, but it would limit the damage. However, because of his harness being on his waist right in front of him, he couldn't get himself into a vertical position. He could only lay back in a horizontal one. And so when he reached the underside of the main deck and he's looking right at this mouse hole, he just put his arms and his legs out and tried to push himself back as if he could fight the winch and keep himself from going into this hole. But there was nothing he could do, and so his pelvis first was pulled into the 10-inch hole. And as his body begins to literally break in half, he's screaming out in pain, and then by the time the hoist operator had hit stop, Gordon was already deceased, and only a section of his torso actually made it up through the hole. Gordon's company was found guilty of being blatantly delinquent on many safety protocols, and so they were fined £60,000, and then they paid an undisclosed amount to Gordon's family. Before we get into our next story, I want to talk about today's sponsor, Current. Current is the future of money management. It's done entirely on your phone and with a debit card. Here's mine. But what they announced just last month is why they're so popular right now. They launched a program just called Interest, which is literally one of the very best savings options on the market right now. It comes with a whopping 4% APY with no special requirements, which in layman's terms means it will generate you 60 times the American national average. And at a time in America where inflation is as high as it's been in 40 years, now is a great time to jump on this offer. It's like you're signing up for free money. And if that's not incentive enough, Current and I are literally giving away free money, $10,000 to you all, so you can start to earn that sweet, sweet 4% APY. All you gotta do is sign up for Current using my code BallenInterest, and then you could be one of 20 people who get $500 from this promotion. Okay, back to the stories. In October of 1994, a middle-aged man named Ivan, who lived in Estonia, which is a country in Northern Europe, was walking in this forest looking for firewood. This forest butted up against the town he lived in, which was called Timiku, and so as a result of his proximity to it, he had spent a lot of time in these woods over the years. But in general, his exposure to this forest was just on the fringes. He would only look for firewood along the perimeter of the woods. But for whatever reason, that day he was just really having a hard time finding good firewood, and so at some point he decided to just walk deeper into the woods to see if he would have luck in there. And so he turns and starts walking into the forest, and very quickly, when the town has kind of disappeared from view behind him, he looked around and kind of liked being in the woods. He didn't go for walks in the woods, and suddenly he was on this nice nature walk. And so he decided, you know what, I can wait on the firewood. I'll just walk in the forest for a little while longer and enjoy myself and kind of meditate. So he just continued walking deeper and deeper into the woods. And after walking for nearly an hour, just kind of mindlessly walking about, he sees up ahead there is very clearly a clearing. And then before the clearing is what looks like a chain link fence. Now, he's never been this deep into the woods before, so he has no idea what this is, but he's obviously curious. And so he decides he'll go see what it is. And so he continues walking closer and closer to what obviously is a chain link fence. And as he's getting closer to it, the trees around him are beginning to thin out. And suddenly, before he even reaches the fence, he gets a very clear view of what's on the other side. And it's this huge multi-story building that almost looks like a factory or some sort of government facility. And it's sitting maybe a couple hundred feet away from the fence, right in the middle of this property. And there's really nothing around it. It's just this cleared out big open area with this big building right in the middle. And there's a fence all the way around it. And so Ivan is totally intrigued by this. And so he walks right up to the fence, he grabs onto it, and he tries to look and figure out what this building is. But there's no clear signage on it, and there's no people anywhere. It's completely barren. There's nothing but this building. And then he notices there's obviously graffiti on the sides of this building, and the doors and windows appeared to be boarded up. And so this building, whatever it is clearly abandoned. And the first thought that goes through Ivan's head is scrap metal. Times were tough for Ivan and his family, and so he and his two brothers, they all lived together, they would go out and they would steal scrap metal and sell it for a little bit of extra cash to make ends meet and provide for their big family. And so he's looking at this big building thinking, you know, if I can get in there, I guarantee you there is some metal that I can steal and I can sell. And so Ivan stayed at this fence just kind of staring at this building for a little while longer and continued to look around to make sure there weren't any people that he hadn't seen before. And after feeling satisfied that this really was a totally abandoned building, he turned around and began hustling back towards town. And when he finally made it to town, making sure to grab some firewood along the way, he rounded up his two brothers and he told them about this find in the forest. And they all very excitedly agreed that that night they would go right back out there and they would go inside the building and see what they could find. And so around 9 p.m. that night, the brothers met up and they had flashlights and a set of bolt cutters, and they headed into the nearby forest and they marched their way all the way up to this fence that Ivan had found earlier in the day. And they lifted their flashlights up and they scanned through the fence all over the property. And when they didn't see anyone, they put their flashlights down and one by one they climbed up and over this fence. And then once they were all on the other side, they began making their way up to this huge building sitting in the middle of the property. And when they got up to this building, they confirmed it definitely looked like it was abandoned, except all of the doors and windows were sealed in such a way that even with bolt cutters, there was just no way to pry them open. They were not going to get inside this building. And so after a little while of still trying to kind of smash their way into this building, the brothers all linked up and they decided, you know what, we're not getting in, and the longer we stay here, the better the chances are that we get caught. And so let's just head back. And so feeling totally dejected, they turn and they start walking back towards the fence they hopped in on. And as they're walking along, they're kind of shining their lights left and right and looking around. And off to the far right side of the property, there is this small shack that they had not noticed on their way in. And so the brothers look at each other and they're like, hey, you know, we're already on this side of the fence. We might as well go check it out and see what's inside of it. Maybe there's scrap metal in there. And so the brothers turn and start making their way over to this shed. And when they get there, they discover it's only secured with a simple padlock on a wooden door. And so they get their bolt cutters, they pop off the lock, they open up the door, and there's initially nothing inside. At least that's what they think. But they move something on the ground and it reveals this stairwell that leads into this underground bunker. And now it's the middle of the night on this abandoned abandoned property they've snuck into. And so there's some apprehension, but they shine their lights down the steps and they didn't see any immediate hazards. And they're thinking, you know what, this is an adventure. Let's go down and see what's down there. And so they all went down the steps. And when they got down to the bottom, they turned the corner and they shined their light to see what's down here. And what was down there was this huge cellar that was full of scrap metal. There was metal all over the ground, and then there were also these shelves that went as far back as their lights could shine, and on the lower shelves there were these weird square metal boxes that almost looked like briefcases, and then above those on the top shelf were 55-gallon aluminum drums. And in the brothers' experience, these drums were very, very valuable, except they needed to make sure they weren't full of some liquid, because if they're full, they weigh like 500 pounds, and there's no way they'd be able to get them out, and then trying to open them up and spill whatever's inside of them is hazardous for a lot of reasons. And so they walked over to the first 55-gallon drum they saw, and they pushed it to see if it was empty. And the drum immediately rocked back and forth, echoing inside, indicating that it was empty. This was a huge, huge win. And so the brothers are totally amazed. They grab this first drum, they pull it off the shelf, and they wheel it over to the base of the steps. And then they go back to get another drum off the shelf, and they reach up, they grab another empty drum, and as they're pulling it off, it dislodges another 55-gallon drum that was nearby that was full of some liquid. So it weighed 500 pounds, and it comes crashing off the shelf, and it lands on Ivan's leg, pinning him to the ground. And immediately the two other brothers pulled the drum off of Ivan, but it was obvious there had been significant damage done to his leg. Ivan couldn't even stand up anymore. And so the brothers are looking around thinking, man, this is an amazing haul, but if Ivan can't even walk, I mean, it's going to be a nightmare trying to haul this metal back while also supporting Ivan. And so they decided they would leave now, and they would wait for Ivan to heal up, and then they would come back and they would collect their amazing haul. And so the brothers, they reached down and they picked up whatever pieces of metal they could to just kind of stuff in their pockets. And then the two brothers supported Ivan and carried him up the stairs. And then they very slowly walked their way over to the fence. And then somehow the three of them got up and over the fence. And then very slowly they made their way all the way through the forest back to Tamiku. And when they got there, the two brothers helped Ivan get into his house and they put him in his bed. And then Ivan went to sleep. The next morning when Ivan got up, he was expecting to feel better, but in fact, his leg felt exponentially worse. And then over the course of the next 72 hours, Ivan still believed if he just gutted it out and he waited, his leg would get better, but it just got worse and worse and worse. And so 4 days after this leg injury, Ivan was in so much pain, he couldn't do anything. And so he finally decided he had to go to the hospital. And so when he gets to the hospital, the doctor asks Ivan, you know, what happened to your leg? And Ivan would tell him that, oh, I was in the woods and a tree fell on my leg, because he didn't want to admit to trying to steal scrap metal. And so the doctors, they accepted this. It seemed totally reasonable based on what his injury looked like. And so they admitted him to the hospital. They put him in his hospital room. And right away, the doctors and nurses began administering all the treatments and things they would do for a crush injury. But it seemed like nothing was working. Over the course of the next several days, Ivan complained endlessly of the pain in his leg getting worse and worse and worse. And the swelling was going up, and overall Ivan's health just continued to deteriorate over his stay in the hospital. And then a week after being admitted to the hospital, so roughly 10 or 11 days after he was hurt, the doctors walked into his room and he was dead. His kidneys had just abruptly failed, and the doctors and nurses had absolutely no idea why. And so they told the family, we don't know what happened to him. And so the family just had to collect Ivan's body, and then they had a funeral for him. But they're all thinking to themselves, how could this have happened? He hurt his leg and then his kidneys failed? It didn't make any sense. But before they could get any clarity on that, they were dealt another tragedy. The beloved family dog just kind of abruptly died. It was young, it was healthy, and so just like Ivan, it was like this totally unexpected death. And so once again, the family's asking, what's going on here? And then just a couple of days after that, Ivan's stepson came downstairs one morning complaining of feeling sick. And when his family looked at his hands. They were blistered and covered in boils and looked like he had just reached his hands into a fire or something. But he would tell his family, I didn't do that. I don't know what's going on with my hands. I don't know why I feel so sick. And so the family rushed the boy to the hospital, and naturally the doctors asked him, how did your hands get this way? What happened to you? And the boy would say, I don't know. But over the course of this initial discussion with doctors, the boy would tell them that over the last couple of days, he had been sifting through his stepfather, Ivan's possessions, and he had actually been using some of Ivan's tools from his toolbox. Now, the doctors were already aware of the strangeness around Ivan's death, and they were aware of the sudden passing of the family dog, and now they're seeing this boy who is showing up with these strange symptoms for no particular reason. And so the doctors knew something was off. And so on a hunch, they contacted the authorities and they told them what they thought. And then later that day, the authorities showed up at Ivan's family's house. And when they got out of the car, they were covered head to toe in white hazardous materials suits. And they told the family to evacuate the house for their safety. And then these people in suits got out these special wands and tools, and they marched into the family home, and immediately all their equipment led them to this one particular closet near the kitchen. And when they opened it up, in the closet was Ivan's toolbox, the same one the boy had been handling over the past couple of days. And when they opened that up, they found there were lots of normal tools you would expect inside of a toolbox, and they discovered one strange piece of scrap metal. It was the only piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed off the floor of that cellar and tucked in his pocket before he and his brothers had left. And then after Ivan had passed away, his stepson had been going through his things and he had discovered this piece of scrap metal, and for whatever reason he had transferred it from the jacket to Ivan's toolbox. What Ivan and his family didn't know was that that piece of metal was extremely dangerous, because it came not from some abandoned building on some abandoned property in the middle of the forest. It came from an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility. That is what Ivan and his brothers had snuck onto. But because Ivan and his brothers had hopped over that side fence, they didn't see any of the warning signs that are posted on the front of the front gates telling people to stay back. Inside that cellar that the brothers were in, those small metal briefcase looking things on the lower shelves were shields for radiation. Inside of each of them was radioactive metal. And when that full 55-gallon drum came crashing off the shelf and smashed into Ivan's leg, his leg was not the only thing it smashed into. It smashed into one of those metal briefcases and broke it open, sending the radioactive metal inside of it flying out, and it landed right next to Ivan on the ground. And so when the brothers scrambled to pick up whatever loose scrap metal there was on the ground, Ivan unfortunately grabbed one piece, and it was the radioactive one. By the time Ivan finally got back to his house, he was actually already dead. He just didn't know it yet. That piece of metal had been inside of his jacket pocket, and it had been pressed against his body long enough that he had been dealt a fatal dose of radiation. There was nothing anybody could have done, even if they knew what had happened to him. As for the dog, it used to sleep on Ivan's jacket, and it did so when this piece of scrap metal was inside of it, and so it too died of radiation poisoning. As for Ivan's stepson, the reason his hands had been so badly burned and why he had become so sick, that was just from his brief exchange of touching the piece of scrap metal and then putting it in Ivan's toolbox. That alone had done that much damage to him. When the doctors considered the strangeness of Ivan's death, the dog's death, and now this boy's symptoms, they did suspect radiation poisoning, and so that was how the authorities were able to get to their house and very quickly locate that toolbox. Amazingly, Ivan's stepson and the rest of Ivan's family, including his two brothers, would make full recoveries. However, several months after this event, and after authorities had come in and said their house was clear of radiation, the grandmother would suddenly die totally unexpectedly. She was healthy, nothing was wrong with her, and so even though it was not officially cited as having been caused by radiation, many people believe it's from the exposure she had to this piece of scrap metal. In 2017, 71-year-old Bernard Gore was a retiree living in Tasmania, which is an island state of Australia. In January of that year, he and his wife of 50 years, Angela, decided to go visit their daughter who lived in Sydney, Australia. Now, they made this trip with some regularity, and they developed a sort of routine for every time they visited. They would land in Sydney, and then the first day they would spend it entirely with their daughter at her house. And then the next day, Angela would get up early, and she would head out into town and do some shopping on her own. And then sometime in the afternoon, Bernard would head out and he would meet up with her for lunch at a very popular spot. It was called the Westfield Center Mall, and they had an amazing food court. So on January 5th of that year, Bernard and Angela, they land in Sydney, and like they always did, they went straight to their daughter's house and they spent the day with her. And then early the next morning, Angela got up and she headed out to do her shopping. And before she left, she confirmed with her husband that they would meet up for lunch at Westfield Center Mall. Now, as it happened that day, Angela actually chose to do her shopping at Westfield Center Mall. And so she was there around lunchtime when she was supposed to meet Bernard. And so when she looked at her watch and she realized it was time to meet him, she just simply stepped out of the shop she was in and headed over to the food court. And when she got there, she found their meeting spot. It was in front of one of their favorite restaurants. And she sat down and then she scanned around looking for her husband. But inside of this busy food court, she couldn't see him. And so she looked at her watch again and she realized she was a couple of minutes early. And so she grabbed a menu and she began looking for what she was going to order while she waited for him to show up. But 15 minutes would go by and Bernard would not show up. And so now he was late. And so Angela, at this point, she pulls her phone out and she tries calling her husband, but he didn't answer. However, that was kind of common for Bernard, so not necessarily a red flag. Angela would continue to try calling her husband for the next several minutes, and each time he would not answer. And so eventually Angela just gets frustrated and she's thinking to herself, maybe he just got sidetracked and he's walking around the mall somewhere, because Bernard was known for being a big window shopper. And as soon as Angela thought that, she was like, that's got to be it. And it was so frustrating for her that he had just totally blown off their lunch date. And so she stands up, she abandons her table, she's totally annoyed, and she heads out into the main shopping area to go find her husband. And so she's walking along, looking in each of the windows, expecting to see her husband. And at the same time, she's looking over her shoulder back towards the food court to see if maybe Bernard had shown up. But after 30 minutes of wandering around kind of right near the food court and not seeing him anywhere, Angela thinks to herself, you know what? I bet he thought we were supposed to meet at our daughter's house first. And so he probably hasn't even left the house yet. I bet he's just there waiting for me. And so Angela, when she realizes this, she stops looking for him in the mall. She turns around and she begins walking towards the mall exit. But before she reaches the exit door, a terrifying thought crosses her mind. What if Bernard got confused and has no idea where he is right now? A recent unfortunate development for Bernard was that he was showing early signs of dementia. It hadn't fully taken a hold of him yet, but he was clearly starting to forget things that he shouldn't. And so as soon as Angela thought of this, she went from being annoyed with her husband to being very worried about her husband. And so she sped through those doors outside and speed walked all the way back to her daughter's house, which was not far from the mall. And the whole time she's walking, she's telling herself she's going to walk inside and she's going to see Bernard. He's going to be in the house. But when she got to the house and went inside and saw her daughter said, "No, Dad left about 2 hours ago to go meet you. I haven't seen or heard from him since." Now, of course, both of them were extremely worried for Bernard, but they decided to just stay calm, that the best thing they could do right now would just be to stay put, stay at their daughter's house and wait for Bernard to eventually come back, because the only other logical place he would go would be his daughter's house. And so they sat at the house just kind of waiting, looking at the door, waiting for him to come in. But he didn't, and by 8 p.m., 6 hours after anybody had last seen Bernard, he still had not shown up. They couldn't get in touch with him, and so Angela called the police and reported him missing. Immediately, the police contacted the Westfield Center Mall security team and said, hey, we're looking for this guy, and they went right down to the food court where Bernard and Angela had said they were going to meet, and the mall security team walked all around, and they walked into all the nearby shops and kind of scanned the immediate vicinity near their meeting spot, but they reported back to police that there was no sign of Bernard. And they would also tell police that after reviewing their camera footage, and this mall had hundreds of cameras covering every angle, inside and out. I mean, everything is covered. They would tell police, after reviewing the footage, we didn't see Bernard enter or exit the mall at any point today. He was not here. And so the police, they take this information and they go back to Angela that night and they say, hey, look, we talked to the mall, and based on their security footage, they have no record of Bernard ever being in the mall. Do you have any idea where he could have gone? And Angela would say, no, the only places would have been the mall or maybe at our daughter's house. This is also when Angela explained to police that her husband had early signs of dementia, and so it was possible that he might have just gotten confused and he could be out on the street somewhere. But she assured the police that her husband, whenever this happened, whenever he got confused, he would just sit down and he would try to ask for help from anybody passing by, or he would just sit where he was and he would wait for his family to come find him. And so with this knowledge, the police went back out and they widened their search and they began looking in all the areas that were within walking distance of the Westfield Center Mall. At the same time, Angela and her daughter began trying to retrace Bernard's footsteps from the daughter's home in the direction of the Westfield Center Mall to see if maybe there was something obvious along the route that might have sidetracked him and kind of led him astray, and that maybe he'd be somewhere else in those directions. But as they were walking around, there really was nothing that stood out to them. And then eventually it just got too dark out and they had to just turn it in and go back to their house and hope that the next morning when they got up, the police would have found Bernard and that he was okay. But the next morning when they got up, the police had not found Bernard. There was no sign of him. There was no clues, nothing. And unfortunately, over the next several weeks, there was no sign of Bernard. Nobody knew what happened to him. On January 27th, so 3 weeks after Bernard had gone missing, a maintenance worker at the Westfield Center Mall was walking down the staff-only passageway. It was basically like this tunnel with no windows, all concrete. They kind of looped around the outside of the mall to help workers get to and from certain locations in the building. He's walking down this passageway when he looks down this one hallway that was very rarely used, and he sees at the end of it, barely lit up from the lights inside, there looks to be some equipment kind of propped up against the wall. And he's thinking to himself, there's no reason someone would leave their equipment at the end of this very rarely used hallway. It didn't make any sense. And so he decided to walk down and see whose equipment it was. And so he's making his way down and he's getting closer and closer, and he still can't quite figure out what it is. The lighting's not great, but when he gets close enough to see what it is, he stops where he is, he turns around, and he runs back down the hallway. He finds the nearest exit, he goes outside, and he calls the police. Back on January 6th, on the day that Bernard and Angela were supposed to meet up for lunch, Bernard did leave his daughter's house and he walked straight to the mall, and he got there. He arrived at the Westfield Center Mall and was picked up on camera walking into their food court. But the staff at the mall who reviewed the footage for police, they only looked at a handful of cameras. There's hundreds of cameras. They only looked at a couple, and so they missed this crucial footage of Bernard. And what the footage would have shown them was Bernard making his way into the food court ahead of Angela. Angela's nowhere to be found. And Bernard, instead of sitting down at their meeting spot in front of this restaurant, Bernard suddenly looks like he's confused, and he turns and he walks to this emergency exit door. He presses it in, he steps inside, and the door shuts behind him. Now, the Westfield Center Mall is not your average mall. It is massive. There are 6 floors to it, nearly 300 shops and restaurants. But what truly makes it massive is something that the public doesn't usually see. And that is behind staff-only doors and emergency exit doors like the one Bernard had just gone through are nearly 8 miles of windowless concrete, narrow stairwells and tunnels that loop all around the outside of the building. And once Bernard had gone through that emergency exit door and that door had shut and locked behind him, the only way for him to return to the food court and meet his wife would be if he completely exited the mall and looped all the way back around. But in order to exit the mall from where he just entered, he would need to go to a very specific exterior fire exit door that was several floors below him, and to get to it required following this very confusing signage on the walls. And so if you did it correctly, you would basically go down the hallway, find this particular stairwell, you'd go down a couple of levels, and then at some point, without really any signage, you would get to the appropriate floor and you'd go down the hallway into this maze of more hallways, and then finally you'd reach this kind of nondescript exit door, and that would be your exit. Finding your way from where Bernard entered all the way to the exit of the mall would be challenging for someone thinking clearly, and clearly Bernard was not. Bernard was confused and likely really didn't understand where he was or what he was doing or why he was there, and so he did not follow these directions. Instead, he just began wandering down the hallway, and he would have immediately passed the one stairwell that would have very circuitously brought him down but out of the building. He passed that stairwell and he just kept on walking, and eventually he walked into this staff-only area, which was even more confusing because there was no signs telling him where to go, and virtually every door he encountered would have been locked. And so as Bernard wandered through this concrete maze and got more and more mixed up and confused, he most likely began yelling out for help. But his sound could not have penetrated the walls, which means the only people who could have heard his cries would have been people inside the hallway with him. And unfortunately, this section of tunnels that Bernard had found himself in was rarely, if ever, used by any of the staff. And to make matters worse, the mall security guards were supposed to come in and do regular checks of all these 8 miles of tunnels and stairwells, specifically to see if people got lost in them. But over time, the security guards kind of stopped doing that. And there were no security cameras inside of this particular segment of tunnels that Bernard found himself in, and there was no cell phone reception. So had he tried calling anyone, it wouldn't have worked. And so truly, Bernard was on his own. And so after several hours or days of Bernard aimlessly wandering around this maze, hitting dead end after dead end and reaching locked door after locked door, Bernard at some point turned a corner and looked down at the end of a hallway, and he saw there was a chair up against the side of the wall. And like he was programmed to do anytime he got confused, he rushed over to it and he sat down and he began waiting for a passerby to help him or his family to find him. But unfortunately, help never came, and he would eventually pass away on that chair. On January 27th, that maintenance worker, he discovered Bernard's body. Following his death, the Westfield Center Mall came out and said they made drastic changes to their security system and how they track people while they're on their property. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to do the like button's eyeliner, but use a wide tip black Sharpie. In the late 1800s, a deadly phenomenon was occurring in America. Fire departments were beginning to use these large safety nets that resembled these huge circular stretches of canvas to try to save people that were stuck in burning buildings. During a multi-story fire, these firefighters would show up and they would get out this big net and they would all take up positions around it, holding on to the edges, and then they would move it directly underneath one of the windows of the burning building, and then they would call out to the people inside to jump out of the window onto the net. And then when they jumped, the firefighters would make sure to maneuver the net to try to catch the person right in the middle, breaking their fall and saving their lives. However, the deadly phenomenon was that these people who were stuck in these buildings were more afraid to make the jump onto the net than they were of the fire. And so despite the firefighters' constant urges to please just jump, they would stay put and they would die in the fire. And so fire departments all over America were desperately trying to find ways to educate the American public about the relative safety of these nets, that certainly making this jump is a better bet than staying in an actively burning building. But despite their efforts, Americans were still staying put in these buildings and dying unnecessarily. In 1883, which was around the time of this deadly phenomenon, a diving instructor working out of Washington, D.C. named Robert Odlum heard about this issue, and he thought to himself, if Americans just maybe saw someone make the jump successfully, they wouldn't be afraid anymore. And since Robert was a diving instructor and so was very comfortable jumping from heights, he thought, well, who better to make these demonstrations than me? And so, in collaboration with several Washington, D.C. fire departments, months, Robert began hosting these demonstrations where he would leap out of multi-story buildings onto the safety net. And very quickly, these demonstrations began attracting very big crowds, but not because they wanted the education of the event. They just wanted to see someone jump out of a building onto a net. It was like a circus act. And Robert, who was not expecting this to happen, found himself really enjoying the attention he was garnering. And so pretty quickly, he stopped doing demonstrations to show off fire net safety and instead began jumping off of huge bridges into bodies of water just because people thought it was awesome. He was becoming this celebrity in Washington, D.C. And soon, Robert began taking his show all over the country, basically touring to all these bridges all over America, and he would put out these flyers all over the city, encouraging people to show up to the bridge on the day of his jump, and then when he would get to the bridge, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of people cheering him on. But Robert's very unlikely and rapid rise to fame and fortune quickly spawned copycats. And in 1885, so 2 years after Robert had begun this jumping venture, his popularity was beginning to wane because he was no longer as unique. Before, it was really just him doing these jumps, and now he was kind of a commodity. And so feeling desperate to become relevant again, Robert thought to himself, I gotta do something that sets me apart from all the other bridge jumpers. I gotta do something that nobody else has done. That way I can once again become the bridge jumper. And it just so happened there was a bridge that had recently been constructed in New York called the Brooklyn Bridge that was massive. It spanned 1,600 feet from Brooklyn across the East River to New York City, and at its highest point, it was a whopping 130 feet off of the water. And so if Robert made that jump, he would actually set the record for the highest bridge jump ever. But by this point, bridge jumping had become popular enough that police had caught on to it and they had made it illegal, mostly to protect the bridge jumpers from themselves. And so anytime police saw advertisements for an upcoming bridge jump, they would show up to the location on the day of the jump in force and they would stop the jumper from jumping. And so Robert knew this, but he still needed to get the word out about this big Brooklyn Bridge jump. And so he created a very clever word-of-mouth campaign amongst people in New York, and he also began handing out these flyers that were fairly cryptic, but still told people where to go and at what time for this big spectacle they were going to see. And on May 19th of that year, the day of the jump, Robert's underground advertising campaign had worked beautifully. By early that morning, the Brooklyn Bridge was covered with hundreds and hundreds of people, also down on the banks as well. There's all these people who are all waiting to see Robert make this record-setting jump. Robert had become a bit of a showman since he began doing these bridge jumps, and he had developed a sort of trademark entrance. He would arrive in a black horse and carriage, and then once it stopped on the bridge, he would leap out, and he'd be wearing this long coat, and he would take it off, revealing his swimsuit, and the crowd would cheer, and then he would wave to the crowd, and then he would just run to the edge and leap off the bridge. And so on May 19th, all these people who are waiting for Robert, they're looking for this black horse and carriage, and around noontime, someone spotted it. It was coming onto the bridge from the Brooklyn side, and then once it stopped on the bridge, the door flung open, and Robert leapt out in his big coat. He ripped his coat off, revealing his swimsuit. The crowd was going wild. Everyone was so pumped about this. He's waving and getting ready, and he starts running to the railing to make this jump, and before he jumps, the police swarm him and arrest him. The police were not dumb. They had caught on to this underground advertising campaign, and so like everyone else, they were out in force on this bridge. There were all these officers everywhere, and so as soon as they saw this carriage, they immediately rushed over, intercepted it, and they stopped him. And so as they're arresting Robert, the crowd is starting to boo, and they're chanting, "Let him jump! Let him jump!" And the police, who are all kind of gathered on the Brooklyn side of the bridge, they're telling people to start to disperse, and as they're doing this, something incredible happens. On the far other side of the bridge, on the New York side of the bridge, another black horse and carriage had just come to a stop on the bridge. The doors had flung open, and a man had jumped out wearing a long coat. He had ripped it off, revealing a swimsuit, and the crowd went wild. It was the real Robert Odlum. The man the police had arrested was actually an actor that Robert had paid to pretend to be him. Robert had told him to show up at a particular time and make the typical entrance that he would in order to suck all the police to that side of the bridge. And then while that was happening, Robert would show up and have enough time and space to make the jump. And his plan had worked perfectly. And so the police, who are on the Brooklyn side, they see this happening and they realize there's no way they can run all the way across the bridge and stop Robert before he makes the jump. And so, like everyone else, they just kind of walked to the railing and they watched. And so the real Robert, after revealing his swimsuit, he waved to the crowd, he's smiling, everyone's going crazy, and he runs over to the railing, he climbs onto the other side, and he's looking out over the water, and he gives one more wave to everyone down below in boats and on the banks and on the sides of the bridge, and everyone's going crazy, and then he jumps. Onlookers would later say that at first his jump was perfect. As soon as he leapt off the bridge, like he always did, he put his right arm straight over his head and he tucked his left arm by his side. This allowed him to stay in an upright vertical position as he fell. But just a second into his fall, a strong gust of wind blew Robert off his axis, and suddenly he was falling on his side. Now, it's important to understand, bridge jumpers, when they jump from really high heights, they need to land feet first in a vertical position. This allows their feet to, quote, break the surface tension of the water before the rest of their body comes crashing down. And if they do it that way, the water functions much like the firefighter's safety net. It will break the jumper's fall and save their life. But if the jumper lands at basically any other angle, the water tension will not break fast enough before the rest of their body hits the surface of the water. And so the water, instead of functioning like a net that will save them, will actually function like concrete. So after this gust of wind had blown Robert onto his side, he began flailing in midair to try to get himself back to his upright vertical position, but he couldn't do it in time, and so he slammed into the water directly on his right side. And when the crowd saw this, they figured something was wrong, but they didn't really know, and so everyone just kind of gasped and waited to see what would happen next. And they're looking, and then finally Robert emerges from the deep, except he's face down and he's motionless. And so some of Robert's friends who were on a boat below, they leapt into the water, they swam over to Robert, they pulled him back to the boat, they got him up on the deck, and when they looked at him, he looked awful. There was blood coming out of his mouth, he was barely conscious, and he would just say to them, "Did I make a good jump?" And then he would die. An autopsy would reveal that Robert's impact with the surface of the water had basically obliterated all of his insides. Amongst other things, his liver, his spleen, and both his kidneys had ruptured, and all of the ribs on his right side were broken. A year later, another bridge jumper named Larry Donovan would make the jump off of the Brooklyn Bridge and survive, setting the record for the highest bridge jump at the time. In 1978, 49-year-old Georgy Markov, who was originally from Bulgaria, was living in London and working as a reporter for the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC for short. Georgy had moved to London 6 years earlier, and in the early days of him being in the UK, he would always take a cab or a bus to work. But over the last couple of years, he had taken to walking to work. Not only was it great exercise, but he also just loved the scenery. In particular, he liked on his commute to stop on the Waterloo Bridge, this very famous bridge in London, where from that position, he had a beautiful view of the Westminster Palace on one side, and he had the iconic London Eye on the other, which is a very famous Ferris wheel. So on the morning of September 7th of that year, Georgy got up and he left his flat, and he began his typical commute into work. However, by the time he reached the Waterloo Bridge and was getting ready to take in the sights, it had started to rain, and Georgy did not have an umbrella. And so instead of sightseeing, he just kept on walking as quickly as he could to try to get to his office before he got completely soaked. But by the time he was just on the other side of the Waterloo Bridge and still had quite a distance to cover to get to work, the skies had completely opened up. And so as much as Georgy wanted to walk, because this was something he really enjoyed, he decided it was not worth it. And so he began looking for a bus stop, and he found one pretty quickly, and he rushed over to it. There was an awning that the commuters could stand underneath, and so he ran underneath this awning, getting out from under the rain, and then he proceeded to wait for the next bus to take him the rest of the way. As he stood there waiting, he suddenly felt a shooting pain in the back of his right thigh, and instinctively, without even knowing what it was, he just reached down and grabbed his leg, but he couldn't feel anything, and then he tried to kind of look around and look down at his leg, but it was just too crowded around him, so he really couldn't do it. And so he's standing there puzzled, still grabbing at his leg, wondering what could have caused this pain. And the only things he could think of were, maybe maybe someone near him had a pen or a pencil out and they accidentally poked him, or maybe it's some sort of bug that bit him, a spider or a bee or something. He didn't know, but there weren't that many scenarios that made sense to him. But before he could spend very much time dwelling on what had caused this, the bus arrived and Georgie turned around, he hopped on board, and by the time the bus pulled up in front of his office building and he had gone through the doors of the BBC, Georgie had effectively forgotten about this pain in his leg. But when he got up to his actual desk and sat down on his chair, when the underside of his thigh made contact with his chair, it sent that shooting pain into his leg, and immediately he noticed it. It was almost like he had a splinter stuck in the back of his thigh, and by pressing it down on the seat, it was driving that splinter deeper into his leg. And so Georgie stood up immediately, and he's grabbing at the back of his leg, and he's kind of craning his head to look down at the back of his leg, but he doesn't see anything there. And so he's standing there wondering what he should do. He's got a really busy day ahead of him, and he's thinking, should I maybe go to the bathroom and see what this is? But then he tells himself, you're overthinking it. This has got to be something minor. I need to get to work. And so he sat back down in his chair, being very careful with his right leg when he placed it down so as not to press too hard on the spot that hurt. And then he just got to work. And over the course of several hours, even though he knew there was kind of a dull, aching pain in the back of his leg, he mostly forgot about it. He was just doing his job. But by the second half of the day, in the early afternoon, the pain in his leg had become so excruciating that Georgie was literally gritting his teeth and sweating profusely in order to try to ignore the pain. But at some point, it just became too much. He couldn't focus on work, and so he stood up, he left his desk, and he walked down the hall, and he went into the single-stall bathroom. And once he went inside and he shut the door behind him, he pulled his pants down and turned around and looked in the mirror to use the reflection to look at the back of his leg. And right away, there was a little bit of a relief there, because what he saw was a little bit of redness, a little bit of swelling, but nothing significant. It looked very much like someone must have hit him with a pencil by accident, or maybe it was a bee sting or a spider bite or something, but whatever it was definitely minor, at least in Georgie's mind. And so he pulls his pants back up, he tucks his shirt back in, he leaves the bathroom and goes back to his desk. And then he sits down, and despite this intense pain in his leg, he's convinced himself it's no big deal, and so he just kind of grits his way through the rest of his workday. When he finally got home again and walked through the door, Georgie's wife looked at him and was like, "What's wrong with you?" He was so pale, he was sweating profusely, he looked awful. And so he told her about what had happened with his leg, and he was still trying to kind of write it off. But she told him, "Georgie, you are sick, there's something wrong, we have to go to the hospital right now." And so at this point, Georgie was miserable, and so he agreed to go. And so the pair, they made their way over to the emergency room at the hospital. They go inside, and a doctor pulled Georgie into an exam room and said, "Okay, tell me what's going on. Why are you here?" And Georgie would explain how in his morning commute, he had stopped at this bus stop and then felt this shooting pain. And then he told the doctor, "I'm pretty convinced this is someone who might have accidentally jabbed me with a pen or a pencil, or it's a bug bite, a spider bite. I don't know what it is, but I'm convinced it's something minor." And so the doctor, he hears this, and he asks Georgie to stand up, pull his pants down so the doctor can get a look at the site. And so Georgie does. He gets up, he drops his pants, and then as the doctor bends down and begins looking at the back of his thigh, Georgie kind of turns around and looks down, and he's shocked at what he sees. Even though he does not have a full view of the back of his leg, it's obvious that the swelling and redness on the back of his leg has grown exponentially. It looks totally horrible. And so after a couple of minutes of the doctor looking at the back of his leg, the doctor stands up and looks puzzled and tells Georgie, "Hold on a minute, I need somebody else to get a look at this." And so the doctor goes out into the main hall, he comes back with another doctor, and that doctor comes over, he bends down, and he looks at the back of Georgie's leg as well. And after the two of them kind of talk to each other and they're looking at the back of his leg, they stand up and they walk around and they're facing Georgie now, and they say, "Okay, this is going to sound totally weird, but when you were at the bus stop, before you felt the pain in your leg, was anyone around you holding a snake or a reptile?" I know that sounds crazy, but the mark on the back of your leg looks exactly like a venomous bite. So Georgie's like, "No, I didn't see anyone with snakes or reptiles. There was nothing out of the ordinary about what was happening around me when I felt this pain in my leg. We were all just standing there, and then I felt it in my leg. That was it." And so the doctors would tell Georgie that, they didn't really know what was going on with his leg. And so the best thing to do here is just to admit him to the hospital and monitor him and, try to run some tests on him and try to make him comfortable. And so that night, Georgie was admitted to the hospital. He was set up in his own hospital room. And right away, the nurses and doctors began administering different combinations of medicines and treatments to try to lower the swelling and the pain in his leg. But it just seemed like nothing was working. And so all night, his condition seemed to get worse, not better. And then the next day, when he woke up, his leg was much, much worse. It was extremely swollen. It almost looked like a balloon that had been completely filled. It was very red. And Georgie himself was also beginning to lose touch with reality. He had become convinced that someone had tried to kill him, and that was why he was so sick. And this delusion of his got so extreme that he was afraid of his doctors and nurses. And so it became a big challenge trying to help him because he was effectively fighting them off. By the next day, Georgie's condition overall had become critical. He was very clearly on the brink of death, and his mind was effectively gone. But the doctors and the nurses really had no idea what was going on with him, and so there was nothing they could do to help him. And then on the last day he was in the hospital, the third day, Georgie would die. His body just shut down. Given the strangeness of Georgie's death, his body was sent for an autopsy to try to figure out what had caused that leg pain, because that seemed to be the trigger that ultimately killed him. And sure enough, during the autopsy, the coroner made a surprising discovery. Buried in the back of his right leg, right underneath the site that was where he felt the pain, was this little piece of metal. It was so small, the coroner actually almost didn't see it. But when he did see it, he put it under the microscope, and what he saw was this obviously man-made metallic disc that had these two small reservoirs drilled into it. And so they sent this disc off for further testing, and what they discovered was there was ricin residue inside of those two reservoirs. Ricin is an extremely powerful poison. It is more lethal than cyanide, and it has no antidote. And the symptoms of ricin poisoning often look like the symptoms of other diseases or illnesses, and so it's very difficult to diagnose. And so as a result of these factors, ricin is a very popular poison for assassinations. And the belief is that that is exactly what happened to Georgie. He was assassinated. But to this day, we don't actually know who assassinated him. However, the running theory is that Georgie, who was a reporter for the BBC, he covered politics, and he often spoke very critically about the Soviet Union. And so this theory goes that the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, known as the KGB, they assassinated Georgie for what he was writing about. Adding credence to this theory, a former KGB officer named Oleg Kaligan, who was exiled to the United States in 1991, he claimed that he oversaw the assassination program that targeted Georgy Markov. He said what they did is they put this little tiny disc, that metal disc with the ricin inside of it, they put that at the tip of an umbrella, and they made sure the disc itself was fairly sharp. And then the KGB assassin with this umbrella simply followed Georgie on his typical morning commute, and then when he stopped at that bus stop, the assassin jabbed him in the back of the leg and then faded into the crowd. According to Oleg, those little metallic discs that had the ricin inside of them, they were actually covered with a thin layer of wax, and only when this disc had been placed inside of the target's body would their body heat melt that wax layer off, exposing the poison, and then their target would die several days later, as Georgie did. However, Oleg's story, despite being as compelling as it was, didn't have any hard proof to back it up. And so to this day, there has been no one officially charged with Georgy Markov's murder. In 2006, 73-year-old Sherman Sizemore was the definition of a man's man. He had spent the bulk of his adult life doing one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, mining for coal in West Virginia. And while he was a coal miner, he apparently had lost track of the amount of times he had nearly been killed from mine shaft collapse and gas leaks. Later on in life, after his kids had all grown up, he had retired from coal mining and become an ordained Baptist minister, and despite his harrowing backstory and burly, intimidating appearance, he was known to be incredibly gentle and very calming to his parishioners. He was also known to be an incredibly devoted grandfather, to the point where if there was a chance to spend time with his grandkids, he would basically throw all of his responsibilities out the window to do that. But in January of that year, something changed in Sherman. He went from being this pillar in the community to being a deranged paranoid lunatic. It all started on the afternoon of January 19th. Sherman and his wife Ruby were sitting in their home alone on the couch, just kind of doing their own things, when suddenly, out of the blue, Sherman just starts screaming as if he sees something in front of him that's terrifying him, and his scream startled Ruby so that she started screaming, and so she looks at her husband, and he's still just looking straight out ahead. He's terrified of something in front of him, and so Ruby looks from him to where he's looking, and there's nothing there. And so she turns back to her husband and she's like, "What's going on? What are you screaming for? What are you so scared of?" But Sherman wasn't able to speak. After he stopped screaming, he just continued to look straight out as if whatever had terrified him had him in this trance where he couldn't look away. And so his eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his face is going white, he's starting to sweat, and Ruby's starting to panic. She has no idea what's happening with him. And so eventually she just holds on to him and says, "Come back to me, come back to me." And Sherman at some point he kind of broke out of his trance. And he looked at his wife and he just says, "You can't leave me or they'll kill me." Ruby has never seen behavior like this in her husband ever. This is a completely different person she's interacting with. And so she has no idea what to do. And so instead, she just kind of holds on to Sherman and prays that he doesn't start acting like that again. But that didn't happen. All day long, periodically, he would just start screaming about something that Ruby couldn't see. Now, Ruby did consider calling 911 and getting medics out there, but his behavior was so unusual, and he was normally such a rock who was so competent, who was so healthy, that she didn't want to. She felt like he would just kind of get through this, that if they can just get through today and get into tomorrow, that he would be better. And so she just all day was comforting him and just dealing with these episodes. And then finally they got into bed that night, and Ruby's thinking, "Thank goodness, we're going to wake up tomorrow and things will be better." But when she woke up the next morning, it was very obvious Sherman had not slept at all. He was looking straight up at the ceiling. He looked worse than the day before. It was obvious that he was not back to normal. And so Ruby called the rest of the family and had them come over to figure out what they were going to do. But when Sherman found out his family was coming to his house, he told Ruby they can't come inside. He was afraid they and others were conspiring to bury him alive. The only person he could be around was Ruby, and his whole family had no idea what to do. Little did they know there was actually a very specific reason he was acting the way he was. A few months before January 19th, which was the day Sherman turned into this different person, a few months earlier, he began complaining of severe abdominal pains. And so he and his wife Ruby and his daughter, they went to the hospital, and the doctor, after examining him and running some tests, determined that most likely his pain was coming from his gallbladder. But the only way to be sure would be to do some exploratory surgery and literally look inside of Sherman's gut and look at his gallbladder and see if that was the problem. And so the doctor asked Sherman, "Are you prepared to do an exploratory surgery, or would you like to just kind of wait it out and see what happens with this pain?" And so Sherman talked it over with his wife and his family, and they made the decision that the pain was just too much, and so they would go forward with the surgery. And so on the morning of January 19th, so again, this is the day that Sherman basically loses his mind, he goes into the hospital completely normal. He goes in with his wife, he goes in with his daughter, and he makes his way over to the surgery wing of the hospital. He says bye to his family, and he's put on a stretcher bed, and he's wheeled in and prepped for surgery, and then brought into the operating room. And while he was in the operating room, laying on his stretcher bed, flat on his back, looking straight up at all these bright lights above him, he just struck up some chit-chat with the nurses and doctors who were in the room prepping the room for surgery, and they were also putting the IV into his arm. Then at some point, one of the nurses lowered the oxygen mask onto Sherman's face so the anesthesiologist could administer the 2-drug cocktail that would knock him out for the surgery. Sherman was scheduled to get something known as general anesthesia for this operation, where basically he would be completely out, he wouldn't feel anything, they'd do the surgery, and then he would wake up in recovery. And so once this mask was on Sherman's face, the anesthesiologist began pumping him full of the drugs that would make him be knocked out for the surgery. However, the anesthesiologist only administered one of the 2 drugs necessary for general anesthesia. He administered the paralyzing drug, but he did not administer the actual anesthetic that would knock him out, and most importantly, would get rid of all of his pain. And so as this mask is on his face and Sherman believes he's being given the proper dosage of drugs, the nurse who was nearby told Sherman to go ahead and start counting backwards in his head from 10, knowing full well that Sherman would pass out before he reached 0. And Sherman knew this too. He had been in surgery before, and so he happily began counting in his head. 10, 9, 8. He started to feel something. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Boom, he was out. Except he wasn't. When he reached 0 in his head, counting down, he realized he had not passed out. He began taking mental stock of what was going on, and he realized he could completely feel his body. But when he tried to move his body, he couldn't. He was completely paralyzed. When he tried to make a sound, he couldn't because his vocal cords were also paralyzed. The only thing he could move were his eyes. He could move them left and right. However, they had taped his eyes shut, so he can't see anything. And so Sherman is thinking to himself, okay, I've been given the drugs, maybe they're slow acting. Any minute now, I'm going to drift off to sleep and this will just be a distant memory. But after a few seconds, he's hearing the doctors and nurses in the room. He can't see them, but he hears them. They seem to be moving towards doing this operation, and he's still awake. And so Sherman becomes frantic and starts flicking his eyes left and right as fast as he possibly can. And the rapid eye movement actually loosened the tape on both of his eyelids, and it created a tiny slit that he could actually look through. And what he saw terrified him. The surgeon was walking over next to him. He was getting his gloves on. And then the surgeon says, "Scalpel." And the nurse hands him this chrome metallic blade, and the surgeon takes the blade and begins cutting into Sherman's midsection. Sherman felt everything, but Sherman couldn't do anything about it. All he could do was rapidly flick his eyes left and right in hopes one of them would see that he was awake, that he was feeling this. But no one was paying attention to his face, so they didn't see his eyes moving around. And so the surgeon continued to cut into his midsection until he had cut out a fairly significantly sized hole, at which point the surgeon hands the scalpel to the nurse and says, "Clamps," at which point the nurse hands him what looks like a torture device, and the surgeon proceeds to use these clamps to pin segments of Sherman's skin that has just been cut open to his body to basically keep the hole open. And then the surgeon began tugging on the outsides of this hole in Sherman's midsection, making sure it was big enough that he could actually get a good look into his body. And every little tug is sending lightning bolts of pain into Sherman's body. But again, all he can do is flick his eyes left and right, and no one's paying attention. "Scope," the surgeon called out for, and the nurse handed him a camera that he jammed into Sherman's gut. And then the surgeon said, "Suction," and the nurse got what looked like a vacuum and pressed it inside of this open wound and began sucking out fluids from his body. The pain Sherman was experiencing is unimaginable. Every second felt like an eternity. "Forceps," the surgeon called, and the nurse handed him these metal prongs that he put inside of this hole in Sherman's body, and he used them to dislodge his gallbladder so he could get a better look at it. By this point, Sherman wanted to die. He was no longer flicking his eyes left and right. He was just looking straight out, hoping someone would finally see him. And someone did. One of the nurses standing next to the surgeon looked up at Sherman's face and saw Sherman looking back, terrified at the nurse, at which point the nurse yelled out, "Stop, he's awake, he's awake!" And the surgeon practically faints, and he looks over at the anesthesiologist and he calls him, "Get over here and fix this." And so the anesthesiologist comes running over from the side of the room. He gets up next to Sherman and begins pumping him full of painkillers. And as he's doing this, he has this moment of clarity. He remembers he didn't give him the anesthetic. And so as these new painkillers that have just been introduced begin to take their effect, Sherman's eyes go from being terrified to glazed over, and he does pass off to sleep. And so now he's out and he can't feel anything. But now the anesthesiologist and the medical team realize they have a very big problem. This patient just experienced 16 minutes of surgery and felt all of it. And at the end of it, when he wakes up, he's going to remember it, and he's probably going to file a lawsuit against the hospital. And so a decision was made. It's unclear if the anesthesiologist acted alone or if the entire team was in on this, but regardless, the anesthesiologist administered an additional drug after giving all these painkillers. This additional drug was called midazolam, but it's better known as the amnesia drug. And like its nickname implies, anyone who gets it will forget what has just happened to them. And so the idea was by giving him this amnesia drug, he won't remember the trauma he had suffered through during during the surgery, and so wouldn't file a lawsuit. And so after he was given this drug, the medical team, they went back to doing the surgery, they completed it, and they got him back out to recovery. And then when Sherman woke up in recovery, he did not remember what had happened to him inside of the operating room, at least not consciously. Those horrible 16 minutes had been implanted on Sherman's subconscious. Basically, his body recognized that he had experienced extreme trauma. However, the amnesia drug wiped away the memory of how he received that trauma. So there's this big disconnect in his memory. And so when Sherman came to in the recovery room, he immediately sensed something was horribly, horribly wrong. He was scared, he was anxious, he had this incredible sense of dread, but he had no memory to tie these feelings to. And so as Sherman is sitting in recovery, he must have tried to kind of hide the way he was feeling because he didn't even remotely understand it. He had been completely happy and normal going into the surgery, and now a couple of hours later, he's a complete mess. And so he leaves the hospital that day on January 19th. He goes back to his house and he sits on the couch with his wife. And as he's sitting there, suddenly these horrible feelings he's having, they become too much. And he basically has a panic attack and he starts screaming out and he's terrified of something, but he doesn't know what it is. And then over the next couple of days, he began having these flashbacks where he would access the actual 16 minutes of torture he went through. But when he would see someone cutting into him and opening his chest up and sucking things out of it, he didn't think that happened to me and that's why I feel this way. Instead, he thought it was just this horrible nightmare that he couldn't escape from. And so his family did eventually start getting doctors and psychologists and all these people involved to figure out what was wrong with him. But before they could figure it out, the whole situation had just become too terrible for Sherman. And so on February 2nd, just 2 weeks after he came out of that surgery, he would take his own life. His family was unbelievably heartbroken. It didn't seem real that this had happened. And so they would continue to dig and figure out what went wrong. And they would finally get their hands on the medical report from the gallbladder exploratory surgery on January 19th. And after giving it to another doctor to look over, this doctor discovered that Sherman had in fact experienced 16 minutes of something known as anesthesia awareness, where you are awake or feel a portion of your surgery. And shockingly, this happens to 20,000 people a year. However, Sherman's case, forgetting the amnesia drug, just literally what he went through, 16 full minutes of this really intensive surgery that he felt, that is an absolute rarity. That does not happen very often. Sherman's family would go on to sue the hospital, and they would be awarded an undisclosed amount of money from the hospital in 2008. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a nice oregano grilled cheese, but instead of using oregano, use crushed up poison ivy.